Q. What were Jonathan Swift's main occupations and roles? A. Jonathan Swift was known for being a novelist, essayist, political pamphleteer, poet, and cleric. Q. In which year was Jonathan Swift born, and when did he pass away? A. Jonathan Swift was born in 1667, and he died in 1745. Q. Who raised Jonathan Swift during his childhood? A. Jonathan Swift was brought up by his uncle. Q. Whose secretary did Jonathan Swift become? A. Jonathan Swift became the secretary of Sir William Temple. Q. Who was Sir William Temple? A. Sir William Temple was an English politician. Q. When did Jonathan Swift start experiencing mental health issues? A. Jonathan Swift became quite insane by 1742. Q. Which college did Jonathan Swift attend? A. Jonathan Swift was sent to Trinity College. Q. Where was Jonathan Swift born? A. Jonathan Swift was born in Dublin. Q. Which school did Jonathan Swift attend before college? A. Jonathan Swift attended Kilkenny Grammar School. Q. Which religious denomination did Jonathan Swift belong to? A. Jonathan Swift belonged to the Church of Ireland. Q. Who was Jonathan Swift's father? A. Jonathan Swift's father was an English lawyer. Q. What was the name of Jonathan Swift's father? A. Jonathan Swift's father was also named Jonathan Swift. Q. In his political pamphlets, whom did Jonathan Swift support? A. Jonathan Swift wrote a number of political pamphlets in favor of the Tory party. Q. What were some of the pseudonyms used by Jonathan Swift? A. Jonathan Swift used pseudonyms such as M.B. Drapier, Isaac Bickerstaff, and Lemuel Gulliver. Q. Which queen showed a dislike for Jonathan Swift and denied him key clergy positions? A. Queen Anne apparently took a dislike to Jonathan Swift, denying him key clergy positions. Q. Besides being Anglo, what other nationality did Jonathan Swift have? A. Jonathan Swift was both Anglo and Irish. Q. What neurological condition did Jonathan Swift suffer from? A. Jonathan Swift suffered from Meniere's disease, a neurological condition. Q. Jonathan Swift had a literary ancestry connected to Shakespeare, Sir Walter Raleigh, and who else? A. Jonathan Swift had family relations to Shakespeare, Sir Walter Raleigh, and John Dryden. Q. Initially, Jonathan Swift was a political pamphleteer for which party before switching sides? A. Jonathan Swift was a political pamphleteer first for the Whigs and later for the Tories. Q. Who wrote the book, A Tale of a Tub? A. Jonathan Swift wrote, A Tale of a Tub. Q. What was the timing of Jonathan Swift's father's death in relation to his birth? A. Jonathan Swift's father passed away 7 months before he was born. Q. Who was the uncle and benefactor that raised Jonathan Swift? A. The name of Jonathan Swift's uncle and benefactor who brought him up was Godwin Swift. Q. What specific event compelled Jonathan Swift to leave Ireland and move to England? A. Jonathan Swift was forced to leave Ireland for England due to the Glorious Revolution. Q. Which individual had a lifelong close friendship with Jonathan Swift? A. Alexander Pope had a lifelong close friendship with Jonathan Swift. Q. Who is attributed with the quote, I shall be like that tree, I shall die at the top? A. Swift himself is credited with saying, I shall be like that tree, I shall die at the top. Q. What was the original name of the hospital for the mentally ill that Jonathan Swift's bulk of fortune was left to establish? A. The bulk of Jonathan Swift's fortune, £12,000, was left to establish a hospital for the mentally ill, originally known as St. Patrick's Hospital for Imbeciles. Q. How many pages long is a recent edition of Jonathan Swift's complete poetry? A. A recent edition of Jonathan Swift's complete poetry spans 953 pages. Q. Who wrote a letter to Jonathan Swift stating, "Cousin Swift, you will never be a poet"? A. John Dryden wrote a letter to Jonathan Swift, expressing the sentiment, "Cousin Swift, you will never be a poet." Q. At what age did Jonathan Swift pass away? A. Jonathan Swift died at the age of 77. Q. What festival is held in honor of Jonathan Swift? A. The Trim Swift Festival is held in honor of Jonathan Swift. Q. Who was the author of Drapier's Letters and how were they published? Ans. The author of Drapier's Letters was Jonathan Swift. They were published pseudonymously. Q. What was Jonathan Swift's response to the continued subjugation of the lives of those in Ireland by England? Ans. Jonathan Swift's response to the continued subjugation of the lives of those in Ireland by England was the Drapier's Letters. Q. How much reward did England offer for the name of the author of Drapier's Letters? Ans. England offered a reward of £300 for the name of the author of Drapier's Letters. Q. What is Jonathan Swift's most historically popular work? Ans. Jonathan Swift's most historically popular work is Gulliver's Travels. Q. Although he was a poet, novelist, and essayist, for what role was Jonathan Swift best known? Ans. Jonathan Swift was best known as a satirist. Q. From which prestigious university did Jonathan Swift earn his master's degree? Ans. Jonathan Swift earned his master's degree from Oxford University. Q. What is the title of the 1722 essay written by Jonathan Swift? Ans. The title of the 1722 essay written by Jonathan Swift is The Benefit of Farting Explained. Q. How many copies of Gulliver's Travels were sold within 3 weeks? Ans. Within 3 weeks, 10,000 copies of Gulliver's Travels were sold. Q. In what year was Jonathan Swift appointed as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral? Ans. Jonathan Swift was appointed as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1713. Q. Who is the author of the Battle of the Books? Ans. The author of the Battle of the Books is Jonathan Swift. Q. In The Battle of the Books, which side did Jonathan Swift favor against the moderns? A. Jonathan Swift favored the ancients against the moderns in The Battle of the Books. Q. Who was Jonathan Swift's first love affair with? A. Jonathan Swift's first love affair was with a woman named Miss Jane Waring. Q. Whom did Jonathan Swift immortalize in his works? A. Jonathan Swift immortalized Estella, a girl whose tutor he was, in his works. Q. What was the real name of Estella? A. The real name of Estella was Esther Johnson. She was the illegitimate daughter of Sir William Temple. Q. Where was Jonathan Swift buried? A. Jonathan Swift was buried beside Estella in the Cathedral of St. Patrick, Dublin. Q. Who wrote A Modest Proposal? A. Jonathan Swift wrote A Modest Proposal. Q. What is the full title of A Modest Proposal? A. The full title of A Modest Proposal is A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public. Q. In what year did Jonathan Swift write Gulliver's Travels? A. Jonathan Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels in 1726. Q. Into how many languages was Gulliver's Travels translated? A. Gulliver's Travels was translated into 3 languages. Q. Who wrote An Argument Against Abolishing Christianity? A. Jonathan Swift wrote An Argument Against Abolishing Christianity. Q. According to Encyclopaedia Britannica, who is considered the foremost prose satirist in the English language? A. Jonathan Swift. Q. What were the two styles of satire that Jonathan Swift mastered? A. The Horatian and Juvenalian styles. Q. In terms of birth order, where did Jonathan Swift stand among his siblings? A. He was the second child of his parents. Q. Which publication did Jonathan Swift serve as the editor of? A. The Examiner. Q. Who is the author of the book, A Journal to Stella? A. Jonathan Swift. Q. How has Jonathan Swift been described by scholars in terms of his political and religious affiliations? A. He has been described as a Whig in politics and a Tory in religion. Q. Why did Queen Anne dislike Jonathan Swift's work, A Tale of a Tub? A. She believed it was blasphemous. Q. In A Tale of a Tub, what do the three sons represent? A. They represent the three main threads of Christianity. Q. Which literary club was Jonathan Swift a member of? A. The Scribblers Club. Q. Who is credited with the quote, "There is nothing in this world constant but inconstancy"? A. Jonathan Swift. Q. When did Jonathan Swift join the Tories? Ans. Jonathan Swift joined the Tories in 1710. Q. What did Jonathan Swift study to become? Ans. Jonathan Swift studied to become a priest. Q. What word did Jonathan Swift use to mention sex between the two? Ans. Jonathan Swift used the word coffee to mention sex between the two. Q. Who wrote the prose works of Jonathan Swift? Ans. The prose works of Jonathan Swift was written by Herbert Davis. Q. What girl's name did Jonathan Swift invent? Ans. Jonathan Swift invented the girl's name, Vanessa. Q. In a modest proposal by Swift, what does he suggest the Irish should engage in? Ans. In a modest proposal, Swift suggests that the Irish should engage in cannibalism. Q. Who named Jonathan Swift as one of the three most influential people in history for John Ruskin? Ans. John Ruskin named Jonathan Swift as one of the three people in history who were the most influential for him. Q. According to a 2017 analysis, what is the most widely held work of Irish literature in libraries globally? Ans. According to a 2017 analysis, Gulliver's Travels is the most widely held work of Irish literature in libraries globally. Q. Who was Jonathan Swift a cousin of? Ans. Jonathan Swift was a cousin of John Dryden. Q. When was A Tale of a Tub published anonymously? Ans. A Tale of a Tub was published anonymously in 1704. Q. What did Jonathan Swift attack the Whig government for in The Conduct of the Allies? A. Jonathan Swift attacked the Whig government for its inability to end the prolonged war with France. Q. In what field was Jonathan Swift considered the greatest? A. Jonathan Swift was considered the greatest satirist. Q. Into what aspects of man did Jonathan Swift fearlessly probe in his works? A. Jonathan Swift fearlessly probed into the follies and hypocrisy of man. Q. How many parts was Gulliver's Travels divided into? A. Gulliver's Travels was divided into 4 parts. Q. By the end of which year were Part 1 and Part 2 of Gulliver's Travels finished? A. Part 1 and Part 2 of Gulliver's Travels were finished by the end of 1721. Q. Who was the author of the poem, Cadinus and Vanessa? A. Jonathan Swift wrote the poem, Cadinus and Vanessa. Q. What did Jonathan Swift's work advocate for in human affairs? A. Jonathan Swift's work advocated for the greater use of common sense and reason in human affairs. Q. True or false? Jonathan Swift never published completely anonymously, despite using many pen names. A. False. Jonathan Swift did publish anonymously at times. Q. What is the title of the fictional biography of Jonathan Swift written by modernist poet Edith Sitwell? A. The title of the fictional biography of Jonathan Swift written by Edith Sitwell is I Live Under a Black Sun. Q. Which famous phrase was coined by Jonathan Swift? A. Jonathan Swift coined the famous phrase, sweetness and light. Q. Who is the writer who named Jonathan Swift as one of the writers he most admired, even though they disagreed with him on almost every moral and political issue? A. George Orwell admired Jonathan Swift despite their disagreements on moral and political issues. Q. In Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift mentioned 2 moons around Mars, which later turned out to be an accurate prediction. Where was this prediction confirmed? A. The prediction of 2 moons around Mars mentioned by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels was later confirmed in the real world. Q. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, who was the first person to use the word cowboy? A. Jonathan Swift was the first person to use the word cowboy, as stated in the Oxford English Dictionary. Q. Who wrote the poem, Verses on the Death of Dr. Swift? A. Jonathan Swift himself wrote the poem, Verses on the Death of Dr. Swift. Q. During which century did Jonathan Swift write? A. Jonathan Swift wrote during the 18th century. Q. What is the full title of Jonathan Swift's work, Gulliver's Travels? A. The full title of Gulliver's Travels is Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World, in 4 parts, by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon, and then a captain of several ships. Q. What was the main objective behind writing Gulliver's Travels? A. The chief objective in writing Gulliver's Travels, according to Jonathan Swift, was to vex the world rather than simply entertain or amuse it.